Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Module 13 of the History of Christianity 2 course. In the previous few modules, we examined some movements in the church which concentrated mostly on what happened in North America. In this module, we'll go back and pick up the story of Christianity expanding around the world to many places that had not heard of Christ before the time of the Reformation, because they were mostly unknown to Christians before the age of exploration. However, in this section, we're not concentrating on the work of missionaries to expand the church to unreached places, although we'll see some of that still. In this section, we're concentrating on world Christianity, that is, the fruit of missionary Christianity. We'll be looking at the churches that existed and flourished in various places after the missionaries had successfully introduced Christ. That is, when the church became indigenous and was fully translated into the native culture, when the church began to live independent of the missionary from outside the culture. This was the result of missionary Christianity grown up and surviving on its own. And we'll start with the timeline. However, in this section, it's a bit different because most of the topics of this section are not datable events, but rather are large, gradually changing and growing movements over longer periods of time, and as a result of the earlier missionary activity. So a lot of the timeline is kind of a big blob all mixed together. However, there are a few specific dates that we'll see, and I'll mention their dates. Samuel Crowther lived from 1809 through 1891. William Wade Harris was 1860 through 1929. The deadly Cultural Revolution in China was 1966 through 1976. And the Lausanne Conference on World Evangelization took place in 1974. Now, let's start by looking at some of the various general ways that the missionary work had happened over the centuries, and I'll start with an illustration of parenting. Now, I don't claim to be an expert on how to raise children, but I know that a 2-month-old needs more parental oversight than a 21-year-old should. As a child grows, at certain stages, they should be able to feed themselves, clothe themselves, speak for themselves, and take care of themselves at various levels. And part of good parenting is preparing them to live on their own. Now, of course, adult children should still be in good relationship with their parents and can go to them for advice or help whenever needed. But if an adult child is still dependent on their parents to the same level as when they were an infant, something is wrong. And ideally, that's the way it would work with missionaries sent to unreached areas. At first, there would be more hands-on teaching and training and even discipline. But as the church matures, it should be able to take more care of itself, with less need for missionary support and leadership. Ideally, there would still be a good relationship with the foreign missionaries and sending churches, but less dependence on them. Now, with that ideal in mind, let's look at a number of general ways that missionary activity happened around the world in various places. The first category I want to explain is imperialism, that is, imposing something on the native culture. And in history, that took two general forms. The first form is economic and/or military imperialism. Now, in our day, we're taught that imperialism is always bad. But it wasn't always the case. It was a mixture of good and bad. There are many examples of missionaries motivated for Christian reasons to bless native cultures. And these were sometimes connected with merchants wanting to have mutually beneficial trade with the natives. One example of this is the Niger expedition in 1841, whose stated purpose was to bring Christianity, commerce, and civilization as a means to end the ravages of slavery. And David Livingstone was a famous missionary doctor in East Africa, giving medical care and fighting against slavery. And outsiders bringing trade, technology, training, and various economic and cultural opportunities often enriched many native cultures in many ways. And they were often gladly welcomed because they brought peace and stability to crazy situations. However, it was not all good, and many natives were exploited by the outsiders. Almost never was it the church or the missionaries that exploited the natives. But the traders and political military entities were the ones that exploited the natives economically and/or enslaved them. And many of this kind of imperial interest was hostile to the presence of missionaries, because the missionaries would help the natives and work against their exploitation. The East India Company was a famous example of resisting missionaries. And these kinds of abuses actually made it harder for the missionaries, because the natives were hardened to their message by the behavior of the other people who looked like the missionaries. But the second kind of imperialism I want to mention is cultural imperialism. That is, bringing in a foreign culture and cultural ideas and practices. And this also was a mix of good and bad. Beyond bringing good cultural ideas like technology and medicine, I'm also referring to more abstract things like ideas of law and justice, which brought peace and stability to many places. And especially, I mean, Christian morality, which worked against things like murder and stealing that had been commonplaces in many places before the missionaries arrived. There's a famous story of a British leader who arrived to govern a part of India that had just been conquered. The day he arrived, the natives were building a funeral pyre, and he was informed that the next day they were going to burn the dead man's widow alive along with his body. And when the British leader raised concerns about this, the natives stated that this was an ancient Hindu custom and they expected him to honor their traditions. So, during the night, he erected a gallows right next to the funeral pyre and stationed soldiers all around. In the morning, he told the native leaders, "I'm willing to honor your traditions and you will honor ours. And it is a British tradition to execute murderers by hanging. So if anyone kills the widow, they will be hanged." And so the tradition of killing widows when their husbands died was ended in India. Now, in the previous course, we talked about the concept of gospel lift. How when people's lives are changed by Christ, it naturally makes any culture better. And added to that is the infusion of Christian character and the ideals of honesty and hard work, etc., and the blessing of God on any culture that turns to Him. All of those have caused any culture that embraces the gospel to become better in almost every way. However, there were also bad examples of cultural imperialism. The kind I want to concentrate on is the imposition of cultural Christianity. That is, forcing an unnecessary change of culture with the gospel, such as forcing the natives to adopt Western ways in order to be Christian, imposing cultural forms of Christianity that are not necessary for Christianity, but just come from the missionary's own culture. And many native churches began to complain about this as they became more mature. One African church leader said, "But what Africa does not need is imported Christianity, because too much of it will only castrate us spiritually or turn us into spiritual cripples." In other words, the missionaries brought a westernized Christianity and sought to impose it upon Africa. That is, Western-style dress, music, and buildings, Western thought forms, etc. Africans were taught by word and example that they first had to become culturally circumcised before they could become Christians. And that brings us back to the principle that every culture must be tested by Scripture, including our own. Because we are creatures made in God's image, some part of every culture will reflect that image by being rich in beauty and goodness, etc. And because we are fallen in sin, every culture will somehow be tainted with sin, and some parts may even be demonic and thoroughly evil. The gospel does not presuppose the superiority of any culture to another, but it evaluates all cultures according to its own criteria of truth and righteousness, and insists on moral absolutes that judge every culture. And therefore, God's people should conclude that some cultural things are better or worse, and seek to influence them for the better. However, missions have all too frequently exported with the gospel an alien culture that was not necessary and was not even helpful. And churches have sometimes been in bondage to culture rather than to Scripture as their authority. And when an unnecessary, unhelpful part of the sending culture was imposed on native churches, it actually held back the native ministries in some way. Now, all of that was one overall approach labeled imperialism. When we evaluate that using the illustration of parenting, that approach was good to the extent that the native church was young and inexperienced and needed oversight and direction, but it became harmful to the extent that the missionary parent was overbearing in ways that were not helpful, or beyond the point that the native church was mature enough to make those decisions for itself. But there was another possible dynamic that was seen in many missionary situations in history, and that is labeled indigenization. Again, using the parenting illustration, this was more and more entrusting the native church with responsibility for itself as it became mature enough to handle it well. This approach is characterized by the goals set out in what is called the 3-self formula. That is the goal that a native church will be self-supporting, that they would cover their own expenses, that they would be self-governing, that they would make their own decisions, and that they would be self-propagating, that they would take responsibility on themselves to reach their own culture and grow on their own. Now, this approach is exemplified in what one African once said to a Western missionary. He said, "Treat us like men, and we will behave like men. Treat us like children, and we will behave like children." And Rufus Anderson wrote in 1869, "Apostolic missions meant gathering converts into churches at the centers of influence and putting them under native pastoral inspection and care. The means employed were spiritual, namely the gospel of Christ. The power relied upon for giving efficacy to these means was divine, namely the promised aid of the Holy Spirit. The main success was among the members of the middle and lower classes of society, and the responsibilities for self-government, self-support, and self-propagation were thrown at once upon the several churches." And Andrew Walls, the missionary historian of Africa, wrote, "It is a delightful paradox that the more Christ is translated into the various thought forms and life systems which form our various national identities, the richer all of us will be in our common Christian heritage." And that brings up the question of means. How did the missionaries seek to meet the goals of the 3-self formula? What did they do to mature the native churches and leaders to get them to the point where they could take care of themselves? Now, part of that was a dynamic we've already seen in an earlier section, which I called contextualized but not compromised. That kind of maturity was sometimes modeled by the missionaries when they challenged certain parts of the native culture and accepted others under the authority of the Bible. Remember, Boniface chopped down the sacred oak of the thunder god to prove that the Christian God is greater, but Hudson Taylor adopted Chinese dress to identify with the people he wanted to reach. And Roberto de Nobili was accused of syncretism because of the extent to which he lived like a Brahmin and accepted some cultural customs. Now, whenever this was done well, it modeled and trained the native leaders also to test everything by the scriptures. And of course, that brings up the second successful means for indigenization, and that is Bible translation. One of the first things that missionaries often did was to learn the native language and translate the Bible into that language. And sometimes that meant creating an alphabet and writing system for languages that had never been written before, and teaching the people to read and write. And there are many ministries today continuing the task of translating the Bible into the world's different languages. At first, providing a Bible in the native language was a missionary tool used to reach that people for Christ, but almost from the start, this became a means for indigenization. Like Luther, the missionaries put the Bible into the people's hands, and God worked through the Word as much as through the missionary. In the year 1900, there were complete translations of the Bible in 119 languages, and translations of portions of the Bible in 537 languages. But the latest statistics I could find from 2023 say that 736 languages have the entire Bible now. 2,394 languages have the entire New Testament, and 3,658 languages have at least some portion of the Bible translated. That means that it is estimated that over 90% of the people on the planet now have at least part of the Bible in their language. Now, of course, we also need to get that Bible to them and a living witness and demonstration of the goodness of Christ through his church. But still, this is encouraging news. And the third means of indigenization has been leadership training. Part of this was the normal discipleship the missionaries did for people who had been converted. But as God raised up native leaders, the wise missionaries tried to give them as much biblical, theological, and ministry training as possible. Much of that was informal, especially in places that did not have formal educational structures. But as many of these places grew in terms of civilization, they became more educated as a whole. And the wise churches and missionary organizations tried to keep the leaders at a higher education level than the people they served. Sometimes that meant sending them somewhere else for training so that they could then return to serve the native churches. But another approach was programs like theological education by extension, which is basically correspondence courses for Christian leaders who could not travel away from their homes for education. And later, there were various colleges, universities, seminaries, and training schools established in many places. These were some ways of training locals to be their own leaders and then continue the missionary and evangelistic task of reaching their own culture. Those are some of the general approaches to missionary work, and they bore fruit. Here's a table of the growth of the number of Christians in each region, and you can see the dramatic growth in all the previously unreached regions, with the exception of the areas under the influence of Islam and its persecution of the church. Now that brings us to the Lausanne Conference on World Evangelization in 1974. You might remember the Edinburgh Missionary Conference that we saw in a previous section, where various different churches got together to cooperate for the missionary task. And that did lead to other missionary conferences, including one in Lausanne, Switzerland, organized partly by the evangelical leaders we saw in the previous section. This conference was noteworthy because more than half of the delegates were from churches that were the product of the earlier missionary movements. There were delegates from 151 different countries. The indigenization of the global church had become a reality. Missionary work was no longer just a white man's enterprise. And some of the delegates aired their grievances against some continued imperialistic methods. They complained about a cultural Christianity, a Christian message distorted by the materialistic consumer culture of the West. They were kind of like a young adult telling their parents to back off and let them live their own life. But this conference continued the commitment to finish the task of evangelizing every people group in the world. One of the results of the conference was the Lausanne Covenant, the document of the conference. The conclusion of that covenant stated, "Therefore, in the light of this our faith and our resolve, we enter into a solemn covenant with God and with each other, to pray, to plan, and to work together for the evangelization of the whole world. We call upon others to join us. May God help us by his grace and for his glory to be faithful to this our covenant. Amen. Hallelujah." And I recommend that you read the entire document from that conference. And there have been more conferences of the same movement still to this day, continuing the program of world evangelization. Now, let's shift gears to look at a few stories of indigenous churches in a few places. And we'll start with Africa. The first story is about a man named Samuel Crowther. His village in the Yoruba region of Nigeria was raided by Muslims when he was about 12 years old, and he was sold by them into slavery. But he was rescued from the slave trade by the British in 1822, and he was returned to Sierra Leone. There he was converted, and he was educated there and later in England. Then he was sent as a missionary back to the Yoruba region, and it was a very successful mission. It was distinctly Protestant evangelical, but it also successfully made bridging connections with the traditional Yoruba religion. For instance, he used the traditional Yoruba name for the Creator God, and dreams were an important part of traditional practice, and Crowther allowed them a place in their Christian practice under scriptural guidelines. And he let the natives work at their own pace to destroy their traditional holy objects and fully reject non-Christian practices. Now, that was risky in light of the possibility of syncretistic compromise, but it seemed to work for Crowther, and the church grew and prospered. Another example is what were called Zionist churches. These were in South Africa in the early 1900s. A man named Daniel Nikanyane was an influential early leader. Now, these churches were very Pentecostal in practice. They combined Pentecostal Christianity with African emphases, like exorcism of demons, ecstatic dance, and prophet healers, but in the service of biblical Christ-centered Christianity. And another story centers around a man named William Wade Harris. He was raised under Methodist teaching, and he testified that while in prison he received a visitation from an angel who told him to preach as a prophet of the last times, to destroy the fetishes of traditional religion and set aside Western dress. In 1913, he went to the Ivory Coast and had a sudden and dramatic impact. Thousands were converted. He organized churches around locally appointed leaders. He was known for the fervor of the Christ-centered message and for the power manifestations in healings and also in the sudden deaths of those who hindered the message. They used traditional music and dance for their services, and this movement became known as Aladura churches. That word means prayer. And that movement had many other notable leaders as well, and has been very influential in reaching surrounding regions. Now, those are just a few of many examples of indigenized churches in Africa. And one more item I need to mention about Africa is that African churches have been on the front line of engaging with Islam for decades, both suffering under persecution, as we'll examine in a bit, but also working to hold back Islam at minimum and reach them with the gospel at best. Now, let's transition to just a few examples of indigenous churches in Asia. And we'll start with China. 1949 ended a 38-year war in which communists took over China. They kicked out all the Western missionaries and closed all but a few officially sanctioned churches. The communist government allowed what it called the three self-patriotic churches. That is, churches that were three self, as we discussed earlier, which means those churches were completely independent from outside influence. But notice they added the term patriotic. That signified that those churches were under communist control. Some of those churches remained as faithfully Christian as they could, but some went the liberal route and became a mouthpiece for the communist government. But other churches went underground and met in secret, and that led to the house church movement. Then in 1966 through 1976 was the so-called Cultural Revolution in China, where the persecution against Christians, among others, was greatly intensified. Pastors were put in jail, and Christians were put in the most menial jobs. One interesting example of this is that Christians were made garbage collectors. Now, in that culture, I'm told, the garbage collector does not pick it up from the sidewalk, but actually goes into each house to take out the trash. What is interesting about that is that it gave Christians access to people's homes. And there are many stories of Christians going into a home, noticing that somebody is sick, praying for them, and they're healed. And then the whole family becomes Christian. So, ironically, something intended as a punishment of Christians actually helped the growth of the church. And there are many other stories like that, where the church grew as a result of the persecution. So, because a lot of the church was under severe persecution, they mostly met in secret, They met in small groups in homes. They smuggled and shared Bibles. And God raised up leadership to replace those who were arrested. Now, it's been estimated that there are about 3 new house churches every 2 days in China. And the statistics vary widely because of the secretive nature of China, but there's been phenomenal growth of the church there. And it's almost certain that now the number of Bible-believing Christians outnumbers the size of the Communist Party membership in China. Next is the church in Korea. Missionaries had been in Korea for a long time. There was small success before World War II, but Korea was still primarily Buddhist and animist. But after the communist takeover of North Korea and the Korean War, there was tremendous growth of churches in South Korea. And they typically make prayer a very high priority. Now, South Korea is a majority Protestant country today. Yoida Full Gospel Church in Seoul may still be the world's largest church. It is a cell and house church based model around a central congregation. And the Korean Presbyterian Church is very missionary minded. They send missionaries around the world, including to the United States. The church in North Korea is still faithfully surviving in secret, but under strong persecution. Now, there are also stories and rumors of the tremendous growth of the church in Afghanistan before the Taliban was given back control of that country. And now that church is surviving only in secret, if at all. It's just hard to know about the status of Christians in that country. Except we can be confident that God will bring them victory, either through faithful perseverance under persecution or through the ultimate victory of martyrdom, which is certainly happening there, at least to some extent. And there are also reports of significant revival in Iran and Saudi Arabia. That's mostly among the youth, because they've been living under Islamic rule and they're sick of it. They see no hope under that system. And when they're exposed to the new hope of Christ, they believe and pursue it. Again, that's just a taste of the many stories of indigenous churches in Asia. And finally, we'll look at a few examples in Latin America. The story of Latin America is different from the other places we've seen, primarily because at least some form of Christianity had been a cultural influence for centuries, coming from the Roman Catholicism of the Spanish and Portuguese conquerors. So those nations already had a history of the roller coaster of faithfulness and decline in various forms. Some were faithful Roman Catholics, some were syncretists combining Catholicism with native religions, and some were Christian in name only. Then, as part of the overall missionary movement, Protestant missionaries tried to reach all of these groups with the evangelical faith characterized by the 5 solas. And the Pentecostals were especially successful in bringing vibrancy, evangelism, and church growth to many parts of Latin America. In 1900, there were only 50,000 Protestants in Latin America, and none of them were Pentecostal. By the 1980s, they had grown to 40 million Protestants. About 75% of those were Pentecostal. And by the year 2000, it's estimated there was almost 150 million. The Yotabeche Methodist Pentecostal Church in Santiago, Chile, has over 350,000 members. And at one time, it was the second largest church in the world. It has a very active outreach ministry. One example, it took over administration of a notorious prison and converted about 1/3 of the inmates, and built a church within the prison walls, and a ministry to transition prisoners back to a productive Christian life on the outside once their sentence was completed. The nation of Brazil has been dominated by Spiritist practices since before Europeans came there. So the Brazilian Pentecostals practice spiritual warfare as a means of evangelism. Now, there's one more item that we need to look at to understand Christianity in South America, and that is liberation theology. Liberation theology is simply the attempt to combine Christianity and Marxism. And that means we need to make a digression to examine Marxism. Now, in our day and culture, Marxism is trying again to exercise influence. So any Christian history that does not at least mention that ideology would be irresponsible. So I'm going to do it. And now is as good a time as any. Because it helps explain some things that happened in South America and elsewhere, and it also helps explain some of the things that we'll see in the next section. So let's define Marxism. Some have called Marxism a Christian heresy, because at first glance, it looks similar to Christianity in some ways. But it is indeed heresy, because it differs in some very core ideas. There are some surface-level similarities between Marxism and true Christianity. Marxism claims to care for and advocate for the poor and disadvantaged. They say they want to right wrongs and bring about justice. And modern-day Marxists will often claim that Jesus was a socialist because he taught about taking care of the poor and disadvantaged. Yet they usually conveniently ignore everything else that Jesus taught and did. However, the surface similarities do not overcome the dramatic differences at the core between Christianity and Marxism. They are almost the exact opposite when you get past the surface. And by the way, Christianity, when it is healthy, it does take care of the poor and delivers justice far better than Marxism has ever done or ever could do. Christianity does not need Marxism and is better off without it. So I will describe some of the core differences. First, Marxism focuses exclusively on group identity rather than the individual. Now, in the Bible, there is some sense of group identity and even group responsibility, and God talks about visiting the sins of the fathers on the children. However, that idea is clearly said to apply only when the children somehow share in and continue the sins of the father, and it is overshadowed by the more fundamental idea of individual responsibility. For example, God told Jeremiah, "In those days people will no longer say, 'The fathers have eaten sour grapes and the children's teeth are set on edge.' Instead, everyone will die for his own sin. Whoever eats sour grapes, his own teeth will be set on edge." And God spoke through Ezekiel. "You ask, why does the son not share the guilt of the father? Since the son has done what is just and right and has been careful to keep all my decrees, he will surely live. The soul who sins is the one who will die. The son will not share the guilt of the father, nor will the father share the guilt of the son. The righteousness of the righteous man will be credited to him, and the wickedness of the wicked man will be charged against him." And the entire New Testament addresses individual responsibility and righteousness even within a much more communal society and culture. Marxism only sees people as part of a group and defines them only by their group identity, but Christianity sees people as individuals. Second, following from the focus on group identity, Marxism divides people as either part of the oppressor group or the oppressed. At first that was defined by economics and class, but modern Marxists concentrate more on ethnicity or other so-called marginalized groups. And that fails on two counts. First is the same error that we just saw of only identifying people by groups. To identify people primarily by their skin color, that's just as racist as anything the KKK did. And related to that is the problem of assuming that everyone in any group is the same. That's just not true. Not everyone in any ethnic group thinks or acts the same, and it's just silly to pretend otherwise. And in terms of economic prosperity, for example, the Bible clearly differentiates different kinds of poor people. Some are poor because they're in genuine need, they're poor because of oppression or misfortune, and we're instructed to give and provide opportunity for those people to overcome poverty. Now, it is also instructive that one of the main provisions for the poor in the Old Testament is gleaning. The poor are given the dignity of an opportunity to provide for themselves instead of the humiliation of dependency. But also, according to the Bible, some others are poor because of poor life choices. Some are lazy, some are irresponsible and chase after futile dreams, Some are immoral and reap the rewards of their sin. For those kinds of poor people, Paul gave the rule, if someone is not willing to work, let him not eat. In other words, in that case, poverty is a discipline intended to motivate people to change. And if we don't recognize the different reasons why someone may be in any particular grouping, our assessment of the problem and our proposed solution will be just as foolish. It cannot be one size fits all, because everyone, even in some particular group, has a different story, and it's wise to deal with them differently depending on their story. And for Christianity, the main problem is not oppression, it is sin. The main problem is not horizontal between people, it is vertical between people and God. Now, of course, that does spill out into horizontal relationships as well, but at root, it is a moral problem of a rebellion against God, not a social problem between classes. And that also means that a member of an oppressed class can be just as sinful as a member of a supposed oppressor class. The one who sins will die, no matter what group they are a part of. When Jesus talked to the poor, he never talked about the sins of the rich. He talked about the sins of the poor. And of course, he addressed the rich about their own sins. And because Marxism is the opposite of Christianity in defining the nature of the problem, it brings about some nasty results. It encourages people to be covetous, envious, and bitter because they're supposedly victims of oppression. And that victim mentality actually robs people of motivation to take responsibility for their own situation. And it keeps people from the opportunities to make their situation better. The victim mentality robs people of dignity and responsibility and makes them infantile and dependent. Henry Hazlitt said it this way: the whole gospel of Karl Marx can be summed up in a single sentence. Hate the man who is better off than you are. Never under any circumstances admit that his success may be due to his own efforts, to the productive contribution he has made to the whole community. Always attribute his success to the exploitation, the cheating, the more or less open robbery of others. Never under any circumstances admit that your own failure may be owing to your own weakness, or that the failures of anyone else may be due to his own defects, his laziness, incompetence, improvidence, or stupidity. That attitude is the opposite of Christianity, which clearly teaches, thou shalt not covet. And similarly, when Cain was jealous and hateful toward his brother Abel, God rebuked him, saying, why is your face downcast? If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must master it. Now, to be clear, Christianity is against genuine injustice, and we're to resist it whenever it happens. But genuine Christianity refuses to claim or believe injustice where there is none. Christianity rebukes the victim mentality and encourages repentance and responsibility. But Marxism feeds the spiteful, covetous, hateful victim mentality. Marxism is the opposite of Christianity in many ways, in the way that it diagnoses the problem of the human condition. And if you think that's bad, the solution that Marxism gives is even worse. This is where I think the difference between Christianity and Marxism is the most striking. Take, for example, the problem of poverty. Both sides claim that we should help the poor, but how does each side want to do that? Christianity wants people to willingly give on a person-to-person basis or through a trusted charity to help the poor. Marxism wants to use the power of the state with the threat of violence to take from some people in order to give it to others. In other words, the difference is between voluntary giving and compelled theft. Charity is not the same as welfare for a number of reasons. First, because Marxism breaks the command, thou shalt not steal. Second, because people have the right to determine how to dispose of their own property, whether to give or not. and they typically use their own property more wisely. Third, because welfare breeds corruption, both on the part of the recipient and on the part of the administrators. If charity takes place at the level of family or church or small community, where it should be located, the people giving know who is truly in need and who is a lazy cheat gaming the system, and they could respond accordingly. But if welfare takes place through a large, faceless bureaucracy, they don't know who's truly needy and who's a bum. And again, this all creates dependency without motivation to take responsibility. And it also breeds corruption in the administration. It's wasteful because it takes away resources that could be used to help in order to pay for the bureaucracy needed to administer it. It's grossly inefficient. And it's also a magnet for crooks who either steal from the system or use the system for personal gain in other ways. When I hear some politicians talk about we need to help the poor, I'm reminded of Judas, who asked why the perfume could not be sold and the money be given to the poor. That reminds me of Judas because the very next verse tells us the reason Judas said that was not because he cared for the poor, but because he was a thief and he helped himself to the money given for charity. Marxism is not charity. It is the government stealing from one group and using part of the money to enslave another group and living large off the rest. That is the opposite of Christian charity. And the difference is also clear in the justification that is given for that theft. That is the completely opposite definition of justice that Marxists used. Biblical justice is everyone living by the same just rules and everyone getting exactly what they deserve based on their own choices and actions, proved by multiple witnesses and investigated without favor, without bribery. But Marxist justice is imposing unequal rules and treating groups differently, whether deserved or not, whether proven with impartial justice or not, in order to get a desired end result. And it actually purposely is partial in its administration of justice to get that desired result. Thus, a person who works extremely hard to get ahead is robbed to reward someone who has not worked hard, because Marxism uses a false definition of justice as an excuse to do the grossest injustice. Now, I totally understand why people are drawn towards Marxism, because it promises justice and equality and care for everyone and the end to oppression. But talk is cheap, and we should judge a tree by its fruit. Christianity has a phenomenal track record of producing freedom and prosperity and justice. Marxism has only ever produced slavery, oppression, and social and economic collapse. And that is all it is ever able to produce. It's no accident the socialist governments are so often led by sociopaths. That's not a coincidence. That is real socialism. The heart of Marxism is anti-human, anti-justice. And it takes a sociopath to do the evil it takes to implement that kind of ideology, because the core of Marxism is sociopathic. Pete Townsend wrote, "Meet the new boss, same as the old boss." But I don't think he was entirely correct, because whenever Marxism takes over, it is always totalitarian and oppressive, far beyond whatever supposed oppressor boss it promised to get rid of in order to take power. Now, you might have noticed that I'm not a fan of Marxism. But as a Christian, how could I be? How can I not hate an ideology that has killed 100 million people or more in the last century and has made the lives of countless more absolutely miserable? I've actually been to the Soviet Union under Marxist rule. I've actually experienced a socialized healthcare system in Canada. I can testify anything Marxism touches, it destroys. It bears the fruit of the enemy who comes only to steal, kill, and destroy. It is the polar opposite of Christ, who came to give abundant life, no matter what the propaganda says. That's because Marxism rejects God and makes the state to be a god in his place. It breaks the first commandment to have no other gods. And that is why it so easily breaks the command against coveting, which then leads to breaking most of the other commandments, including the ones against stealing and murder. All right, all that was a digression to understand Marxism better. And like I mentioned, liberation theology was the attempt to combine Marxism with Christianity. And based on what we've seen, that's pretty impossible to combine two things which are so opposite to each other. Therefore, most liberation theology turned out to be similar to theological liberalism in that it replaced biblical religion with Marxism, but tried to disguise it by still using Christian terms. Marxism, not Christ, is the driving force of most liberation theology. It claims to be all about a preference for the poor and working against unjust structures for the sake of the poor. Now, the Bible clearly says not to favor the rich or take a bribe in deciding justice, but it also clearly says not to show favoritism for the poor either. So the primary category for God's people should be true justice and righteousness by God's standards. And so when liberation theology shifts the primary category to rich and poor, it actually perverts justice, like all Marxism does. And worst of all, it puts the focus on the poor and social issues more than on Christ himself. Like the social gospel, it failed to fix social problems and even made them worse in most cases, because it distracted the church away from Christ and the gospel, which is the only way to bring genuine social change for the better. The idea of liberation theology infected and hindered many churches in Latin America, and to a lesser extent in Africa and Asia. And it also weakened many churches in North America, especially as it morphed into other forms, such as Black liberation theology taught by a man named James Cone. So the influence of Marxism was harmful to the church whenever it was allowed to influence the church from the inside. And Marxism was also extremely harmful to the church from the outside. Which brings us to one final topic that I need to mention about the worldwide church in the last few centuries. That is the continuation of the need to endure strong persecution. The churches in various places around the world have been severely oppressed. The greatest oppressors have been Marxist governments and Islam, by far. The church has suffered or still suffers under Marxism in places like Russia, China, North Korea, Cuba, Cambodia, Venezuela, and many other places. And the church is always oppressed under Islamic rule, such as in Iran or Afghanistan and Saudi Arabia and Pakistan. And those countries on the border of Islamic influence, such as Kenya, Nigeria, and India, see the regular attack of Christians by Islamists seeking to intimidate or oppress them. Wherever Islam has met with Christians, it has always attempted to force them to submit to Islam and use violence and persecution when they didn't. But Christians have also experienced persecution in other places, such as in Colombia under the cartels. And lately, Christians in formerly Christian majority countries have seen an increase of government oppression. One example, recently Finland filed charges against one of its ministers of parliament for quoting the Bible in a church publication in a way that went against the approved public narrative. And who knows where it will go from here. Christ promised that his followers will be hated and persecuted, and we must all be prepared to respond well. Now, let me say just a brief word of evaluation. And that word is, I don't know. There are just too many things going on in all that we covered for me to give any sort of evaluation. And I just don't know enough depth in most of these stories. I don't know enough about most of these cultures to have anything definite to say. I will make an educated guess. I'm going to assume that it's mixed. There's some good and some bad, just like every other human endeavor. God does great things through faulty humans who manage to mess it up, at least in some way. There is always a danger of syncretism, of getting too closely mixed with an unchristian culture, and that probably happened. There's always a danger of not connecting enough and rejecting things that God has blessed. and that likely happened as well. And there's also an opportunity to be contextualized without compromise. And I believe that also happened in many places. So we'll trust God and those people directly involved to evaluate each of the various churches around the world. And we'll continue to fellowship with them and help them as much as we have opportunity. And we'll continue to pray for them, that God will bless them and protect them and grow them in the most appropriate way for their situation and for His glory. But in the meantime, let's review. We surveyed world Christianity that was the result of the earlier missionary movements. We saw the approach of imperialism, which in some cases resembled overbearing, oppressive parenting, but in some cases resembled good parenting. And we saw the approach of indigenization, which resembled good parenting, helping the churches survive on their own. This kind of independence led to growing churches that were faithfully Christian in many places, but they did not look exactly like the churches in the cultures that had sent the missionaries. And we looked at some of the means for helping the native churches, such as Bible translation and leadership training, and we noticed the tremendous growth, especially in the global south and in Asia. And we looked at a few representative stories of indigenous churches and the persecution the church has suffered around the world. And that brings us to a few discussion and application questions. First, what did you learn about contextualization, imperialism, and indigenization? How can the church contextualize the gospel without compromising into syncretism? What are some examples of how to reach people cross-culturally? What are some examples of what to do and what not to do? And what general principles can you learn from all that? How can you apply those principles cross-culturally? And how can you apply them in your own culture? And what difference should these ideas make in your own life and ministry? Second, what did you learn from the stories of churches around the world in different cultures and situations? What stood out to you and why? What was different about the churches and ministries covered from the churches in your own culture? What was the same? What do you think is good in any of the churches that you learned about? Why did that stand out to you as good? How do you think you could apply that good insight to your own situation? And what about those churches raised a red flag of caution in your mind? And why did that strike you as risky or dangerous? Did you consider it dangerous in the cultural situation of that church, or would it only be risky if you try to do it in your own culture? Explain why you think that way. And in general, what principles did you gain from the various world's churches? How can you apply that to your own situation? And in what specific ways do you intend to put these insights into practice? And finally, you knew it was coming and there's nothing you can do to stop it. What else did you learn and how does it apply? Now, speaking of knowing what's coming, now is the time to pause for discussion and thinking through the application of what you've learned using these questions as a starting point. Feel free to pause the video and take all the time you need. And when you're ready, come back and I'll give you some guiding principles to help. So pause the video now. Now let's resume for some guiding principles that I would like you to get out of this section's material. First, be witnesses for the Lord. That is a mission given by Christ in Acts 1:8. And it does not only apply to the original apostles. It applies in Europe, Asia, Africa, North and South America, Australia, and yes, even Antarctica. It applies whether you're a pastor or a student or a brand new Christian. Of course, the way we're witnesses will vary in many ways, but all of us, in our actions and especially with our words, should tell people about what we know and have experienced, because the world needs Jesus. Second, be totally devoted to Christ. We've seen some great examples of those who went in missionary service and the people who live out Christian life and witness in difficult places, including under severe persecution. Even if our situation is not as dramatic, all of us should settle in our hearts and work out in all of our actions that we belong to Christ as His loving servants. and we want to please him and do his will in every circumstance. And that includes making costly sacrifices whenever necessary, because we trust that he will pay back anything we lose for his sake with something far better, ultimately leading to the unending experience of life in his presence. Third is a principle that you've seen before, that is, test every culture by Scripture. And this section has given many examples where that was and still is necessary. Now, of course, there are many different cultures around the world, and we need to do this if we move to a different cultural situation. But even if we stay in the same place, the culture is constantly changing around us. And so we need to continually follow this principle wherever we are. And that leads into a reminder of the principle of contextualize without compromise. We should be willing to make connections with people different from us, even if it's uncomfortable or inconvenient. Build bridges so that others can know Christ. But we always do this with caution. We want to be welcoming to people, but never approve sin. We want to influence people for the good, but never compromise ourselves or the reputation of Christ to the bad. Fifth, I suggest we aim for wise, intentional indigenization. That means we should reach people where they're at and take care of them as much as they need, but always work towards helping them develop themselves so that they can take care of themselves. Now that applies if you're a parent. That applies if you're a missionary training new converts in an unreached place. That applies if you're doing charity work in order to avoid making people dependent on you. And that applies if you're a leader in a church or other organization. Always be working to raise up the next generation of leaders and work yourself out of a job. And that includes tilting the culture slightly to the next generation. I say slightly because North America has typically gone too far in making everything about being young and cool and ignoring the wisdom of experience. So be working toward the next generation. But one of the best ways to do that is to train them to learn from the wisdom of prior generations, and primarily from the wisdom of God in the Bible, so that they don't have to learn from their own mistakes. And it also means that we should be intentional about setting up mentoring relationships across the cultures and generations. For instance, in Titus, Paul commanded that the older women would teach the younger women how to live well. And that kind of thing applies to all sorts of relationships. We should be open-handed, helping people to learn and live out Christian discipleship in their lives, in their situations, and not just trying to duplicate how it worked out in our lives and situations. And the final principle is a reminder that Christ is building his church. On the one hand, that means that he does not need my help. I'll confess, I had nothing to do with the growth of the church in China or in South America, and yet it still grew, because God knows what he's doing without my input. And so I don't have to carry the burden for the worldwide church. The world already has a Savior. If I was responsible for the whole world, that would absolutely crush me, and the world would be totally let down. The world cannot rely on me, nor should it. So I'm free from the stress and burden of meddling in other people's business. But on the other hand, God has invited us all to participate in what he's doing. We can pray, we can give, we can go, we can do our part wherever we are and in whatever way is available to us, trusting that God will use our meager and inadequate contribution and make it into something worthwhile and world-changing. Our labor in the Lord is never in vain, because God is building his church. So, we've covered the entire world in one lecture, and that means we didn't cover much depth at all. And so, it's still very much that you can learn wherever you want to pursue this topic further, but I hope this has given you an idea of the kind of things that God has been doing. And I pray it's inspired you to participate in what he's doing in your own way, in your own part of the world. And I pray that God will empower and guide you to put what you've learned into practice. In the next section, we'll start to look at a turbulent and pivotal time in North America and some of the ways that the church responded. And I hope you'll join us. Thanks for watching.